This episode of Let's Dig Deeper podcast is supported by the University of Copenhagen's School of Archaeology. Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun. I am a student of classical archaeology here at the University of Copenhagen, and in this podcast, I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the amazing people working in the field. We'll talk with archaeologists, historians, professionals, and beyond. Hopefully, we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today, I'm joined by the wonderful Christina Videbech. Welcome to the studio, Christina.
Thank you very much.
And Christina, you are a postdoc at the University of Bergen in Norway, where you also got your PhD. You got your degree in classical archaeology from here, the University of Copenhagen, and currently you are a guest researcher at Aarhus University, where you lead the research project The Fora of Rome and Their Christian Graffiti, or FROG, which is an acronym I really like. And you're also the co-author of the book Sindets Ild, or Fire of the Mind, which you co-authored with your father, Paul Videbech, who is professor of psychiatry here at the University of Copenhagen. And in this book, you take a closer look at mental illness in antiquity, specifically in ancient Rome. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today: mental illness, insanity, and how ancient sources depicted these things, especially in the case of emperors and other prominent people. So my first question, before we really dive into today's topic, is more context related. So when we talk about mental illness in classical antiquity, do we mean it in the same sense as we do today, or what did the ancients believe?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we don't at all. There's a very huge difference at what they thought in antiquity was actually insanity and what we do today. And even today in different societies, you also have difference. What is insanity? So, for example, for religious people, you would say that maybe speaking to God is not necessarily a strange thing to do. But if you're an atheist, you might have a different view on that. So just something that is so close to us already is very, very different. So also in antiquity, for example, you would think that exactly like speaking to gods, maybe even sometimes them visiting you, that would be kind of a warning signal in today's society. But in antiquity, that could be considered normal, potentially. Not necessarily insane, at least, because you were actually living in a world where you thought that gods could do these things. So to make a very long answer very short, there is a very, very big cultural component to what we actually see as insanity. And that is also the reason why you have to be very, very careful when you label antique people or just people from another culture insane, because it might be completely different in their cultural context.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now let's dig deeper. So in a moment, I'll ask you a bit more about the diagnosing and treatment of mental illness. But before that, I think it would be great if we could mention who our sources are for this conversation. Because obviously, the people who had these issues themselves aren't here to tell us about it. So what sources do we rely on instead?
Well, we rely on specifically our cases of insane, quote unquote, people in our book is emperors and empresses. So for them specifically, it would be the usual suspects like Tacitus, Historia Augusta, all these sources that each have their problems and biases and also quirks.
Yeah.
But also we, in more general context, like the ancient view on insanity, we also look on medical theaters from that time. So we looked at Galen, for example. He's one of the best known, but there's a couple of different authors that actually look into insanity and try to diagnose people, talk about cases. So, for example, we have Galen, who talks about a person who can talk with the dead.
Okay.
Who is, in Galen's view, clearly insane and who he tries to treat. We don't know actually how this went.
No.
We also hear from other authors about people who thought they were bricks.
Okay.
Yeah, so they were terrified of water because they thought they would dissolve.
Yeah.
We have people who talk about, for example, there's this one man who was so afraid to starve to death due to poverty that he stopped eating because he didn't want to become poor, so he couldn't eat. Bad.
Oh, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. And which is actually kind of fun because I talked to my dad about this exact example and he said, we actually do have these kind of patients today who do this kind of circular argument with themselves where it ends up very, very badly.
Okay, wow, who get trapped in sort of a loop in their own mind.
Yeah, like have some sort of psychosis. And we also have this woman, this is also a fantastic story about a woman who thinks she has slept and eaten a snake by mistake, and now it's living inside her stomach. And she's so afraid because now it will kind of eat her from the inside out, and she's completely afraid. And then the doctor tries to kind of talk to her, actually do some sort of therapy, kind of. And it doesn't work at all. So in the end, he decides, okay, the only thing we can do is to get her to vomit, like really much. So he gives her medicine so she vomits and vomits. And then he pushes a dead snake into her vomit and says, see, you vomited up the snake.
Oh, does that work?
We don't know, actually, which is kind of sad, which probably means it didn't work.
They would have told us.
Or maybe it had, babies inside of her or whatever. So I think she would need some more serious treatment than that. But it was a good try, I think.
It was definitely an interesting
yeah.
version of it. All right, so there are definitely different ways of looking at mental illness. So we've talked a bit about what mental illness was defined as back then, but how would an ancient physician, or then even just a regular person, recognize that someone had a mental illness? I mean, would they diagnose, or would they just identify symptoms and be like, something is clearly wrong with this person?
See, that's again very context specific. And also it's very different depending on if it's a medical doctor or an ancient doctor, of course, or a normal person in ancient times as well. Because we see that in general, the normal people, you would say people who are not educated doctors, they would usually tend to believe that either these people were touched by a god in some way or maybe a demon of some sort.
Okay.
So it was like outside forces kind of handling these people, and that was what made them insane. And some of them would even be revered because of their insanity, because they were, well, if you're touched by a god, you're obviously very lucky, and maybe that luck will rub off to me.
Yeah.
Some of them was also completely due to their illness, where they had to be contained in some sort of way, and then you would just do that. Doctors had another view. Generally, there was this view that humans consisted of different materials, such as phlegm and black bile and all these sort of things. So doctors thought that if you were insane, it meant that some of this was not in order. So you had to kind of arrange that in a new way. So very logically, not very nice, but very logically, you would have to maybe get something out of your body or maybe inside your body or maybe both.
To balance it out.
So what they usually did was to make people vomit, because then you would get some of this out, or maybe the other end.
Yeah.
That was some of the things. They could also think that it was maybe because you were too overheated. If, for example, you had a psychosis, so you would call it manic or hysterical, then they could shave your head, because then your brain would cool off.
Okay.
But there is generally kind of this idea that, a very holistic idea actually, in which in a way seems very modern, that body and mind was completely connected. So if you were sick in the mind, then there was something in the body. It was a symptom of what was wrong with your body, or the other way around. So this could not be separated. And we have, I think it's Plato who actually says this, that it's a bad doctor who doesn't consider the sickness as a holistic thing.
And that's actually exactly my next question, because there was this general understanding of the mind and the body as very interconnected, holistic, as you say. So if the body suffers, so too would the mind. Did this shape the way that people would think and treat mental illness?
Very much, because then it would be basically the treatment for psychic problems or mental problems would be physical. So what you would do, you would give different things. So you would vomit, you would kind of get rid of all these bad things you had in. You could bloodlet people, so they would get the excess blood out of the system. You would maybe do exercise. There was this actually also very timeless idea of you would get better if you walk it off.
Yeah.
Or maybe run, or if you're very
do Pilates.
Manic, yeah, if you're very manic, then go and do a lot of exercise so you become so tired so you fall asleep, and then you're not manic anymore. At least not as long as you sleep. Which makes sense in a way. It's not bad, but it doesn't help everything.
It's very simple logic.
Yeah, and much of it, good sense in a way, but it's just not enough. What they don't have is actually therapy in the way that we know it. They don't really believe that much in therapy. And doctors, we do have some doctors saying that maybe you should talk to a philosopher if you have problems with your mental state. But it's very, very few. We also have examples of people where they try to educate them out of their sickness. So they, for example, tell them to go to the theater, which is a nice cure, I think. I'm not sure it worked, but it is a nice cure.
Just as a distraction, or?
No, to kind of educate the mind so you can get out of this state of bad mental health.
Okay.
And also read poetry, read books, good literary works. Obviously not bad poetry, but good work. And then if you become wiser, you kind of heal the soul. That's
so feeding the soul in a way.
Yeah, in a way.
Interesting. So what were some of the specific treatments for different mental illnesses? What sort of medicines would they use? You said that therapy was maybe not as widespread, but I'm thinking of things like diets and lifestyle changes.
There is literally not one cure. You would say shades of the same cure that goes again. And no, they're not really, because in their diagnosis, they're only diagnosing very broadly. So you can be manic and you can be hysteric, but they're not necessarily in agreement what that actually entails. And they also kind of treat people trial by error. It's if it works, it's fine. Otherwise, we just go to the next thing. Okay. And if you have tried everything and nothing is working, then maybe you should take, the good gloves off, and then you might use violence, for example, to kind of beat it out of them.
Okay.
So there's two different schools, but put very roughly. There's these people who think that, no, we feel bad for these people, we should treat them well. And then there's the others who's like, no, they just have to kind of adapt to society, because that goes through all the sources. Insanity becomes a problem when it affects society and the people around them. And that also means that if there is no cure, if you have someone who has what we today would say a deep psychosis, seeing things, hearing things, and getting violent because of that, acting out, then you could, in worst case scenario, you could just bind them to their bed.
Yeah.
And that would be it. So in the end, the sick person is secondary. The society is most important. And sometimes when people who have mental illness maybe even kill people, we hear about that also today. So I can see why you would be frustrated. And what can we do with this person who is acting out all the time, who is throwing stuff at people? So we have to do something. But of course, it's not very humane to actually treat people like that.
Was there an overlap between physical and spiritual treatment? I mean, was it always medical or also religious? Meaning, would they only seek help from physicians and doctors, or also, as you said, philosophers or maybe priests in temples?
Yes, we actually very, very rarely hear about the religious treatments. I would imagine that they were there, because when we look at temples, archaeologically speaking, we can see a lot of these votive objects. So we know that if you had a broken leg, for example, you would likely go to the Asclepius shrine, and then you could put something there and hopefully he would heal you.
Yeah, that's where you see these plaster casts of a foot or a hand or a leg.
But we have as far as I know, no votive offerings in the shape of a brain.
No, yeah, okay.
So, yes, most likely they would do this because that would make sense in that society, but we do not read about it. But that could also be some sort of bias from the medical sources, that is not kind of that's not their niche. If you go to the temple, it's out of their hands. That's not what they do. But they do, I think we actually read about they may say a prayer or something, because, of course, medical and religious practice was not completely separated. Nothing was in this society. But I haven't read that much about it, actually. But as I said, it might have something to do with the biases of the sources, because obviously they would like to publish their own results and not the results of the priests.
Yeah, of course. You don't want your competition to do better than you.
No.
All right. Over time, there's been this narrative of the mad emperor. I'm putting this in quote, but I guess people have heard this. Especially when we talk about emperors like Nero or Caligula, they're often painted as insane or even downright evil. Could these stories be a reflection of their struggles with mental illness, or is it more likely that it was just the result of political propaganda from their enemies?
Both. Very, very shortly, both. But actually, what my dad and I found when we were reading these, which was kind of a surprise to me, because I had heard about the mad emperors. That's why we began the research for this book to begin with. But what we actually found was that we believe none of the emperors in our book were actually insane in a clinical sense.
Okay.
They did have mental struggles.
Yeah, to put it in that way.
Yeah, but they were not insane. And that's actually very interesting for example, with Caligula, it has been suggested that he maybe was schizophrenic, but there's actually no clinical signs of schizophrenia. Actually, there's a lot of signs that he wasn't, because one of the big problems for people with schizophrenia is, for example, that their memory will be impaired because to put it very shortly, their mind is on overdrive, so they can't concentrate on everything. And he has an exceptional memory. And we know he's a very good speaker. That doesn't work at all with schizophrenia. Also, he's very social. Not necessarily in a good way, but he is very social. And that's, again, nothing that you see in schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia will tend to kind of draw away because it's too much with all the other people because they have so much going on inside. I'm only kind of generalizing, but so it doesn't really, so he's actually not insane at all. And we had the same with the other emperors, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have problems. They were not really sympathetic people, many of them.
No.
We have one exception we can talk about later. But people like Nero, Caligula, Elagabal, that sort of people, they were not really nice people. What we find in the book is that the people that we see described in the sources, and I'm very particular in framing it like that, likely had some sort of personality disorder. So that's what we actually suggest. But the reason why I say the people described in the sources goes back to your question. We do not know if the actual Caligula or Nero or Elagabal actually had these mental illnesses, because we know that these sources are not necessarily telling the truth. And you can also see that, and we do treat it in the book, that sometimes they're saying different things that doesn't really at all match up. So we know there's lies in there. We know there's exaggerations. We know things are kept out of it. And good example, Nero is portrayed as the worst emperor ever.
Yeah.
He's almost even worse than Caligula.
Famously bad.
Yeah, famously bad. But to go back to my graffiti project, actually, one of the emperors who is most generally praised in the graffiti from Pompeii is Nero. Which doesn't add up with that at all, because that means that he was actually very popular with the people. So there's something here happening where we must, as archaeologists, and that's also why I think as an archaeologist, and I really stressed it in the book also, that I can give something extra that a historian couldn't, that the archaeological sources can sometimes go and kind of pick at these narratives and then say, maybe that was not really the case. Maybe this is just what Suetonius is saying, and why is he saying what he is saying.
To point out these discrepancies.
Yeah. So we, in the book, and generally, I think when you look at these people, you should be very, very clear that you are diagnosing the Caligula of Suetonius.
Yeah.
You are not diagnosing Caligula, because you can't. That being said, there are likely some real things inside these sources as well. So it is the closest that we actually get to these emperors. And what we think with the book is then that we can look at these, and we can look at these caricatures of these people and then maybe use them as a mirror for ourselves and how we view mental illness. And in that sense, I think the book and the whole idea of diagnosing people that are long dead is actually justified.
Yeah. What do you diagnose Nero and Caligula with in the book?
Yes, we think that they have, both of them have personality disorders. Caligula, again, of the sources, we diagnose as narcissistic and with antisocial behavioral traits. Maybe he is also a little bit histrionic, which means that he likes to kind of put himself in the center and be very theatrical type. And he is definitely, above all, a narcissist. That's his most prominent trait, because it's very normal for people with these personality disorders that you have several of them, but then you usually have one that is more pronounced than the others.
Okay.
And in that sense, Nero was really interesting, because we think at foremost, he has the narcissistic and antisocial disorder as well, but he is histrionic more than anything else, which would explain why he likes going to the theater, being at the center of attention, and always trying to put himself there. That is really a trait from that. And also kind of saying he's the best and I'm a big actor and the world loses a big actor with me and all that sort of stuff.
Famous last words.
Exactly. We don't know if he actually said it, but if we look into the sources, that person they describe there is clearly histrionic before anything else. We describe him in the book as kind of the elephant in the glass store, and the glass store is on fire. So everything is just... And I think that's a very, very accurate picture of what is happening with Nero.
Yeah, everyone could see it.
He's also actually a very good example of when we know that the sources get something right. For example, the murder of his mother.
Yeah.
That is one of the things where we know this was true. So... Again, we can see there is truth in there. It's just very hard to dig it out.
Yeah.
You have to dig deeper.
But that's literally the job of the archaeologist, am I right?
Exactly.
Other emperors like Tiberius were described by ancient authors as an almost demonic emperor in a way. And in the book, you suggest that he may simply have been neurodivergent. So what can his case tell us about how the Romans understood difference, disability, and mental health in general?
Yeah, Tiberius is my favorite case of them all because I went into the case thinking that he was horrible. There's these famous stories of him, so I really had a bad impression of him.
Yeah.
And then I went in and I read all the stories about him, and we had just diagnosed, quote unquote, Caligula and Nero before that. So I was just like, oh my God, this is a personality disorder again. This is not, he's maybe a little bit narcissistic, but definitely schizoid personality disorder, which is a disorder where you kind of, it is very close to schizophrenia, but it's not, but where you kind of avoid being with people and you hate interaction and you kind of try to be alone. And then I presented this to my dad, and he was like, he read through it and he read all my quotes I had, and like, this is this and this is that, and he's doing this, which means that he must be blah, blah, blah. And he was like, yeah, that's really interesting, Christina. I think you're wrong.
Okay.
I was like, what? I'm not used to that. But no. And then he told me, because there was this one quote that I didn't actually read that much into it. But in the later years of Tiberius' reign, he goes to Capri.
Yeah.
Most of us know. But he actually tries to come back to Rome. And he does that several times. And we have, I think it's Suetonius, who talks about how he's coming to Rome and he's circling outside of Rome because he want to go in. He knows he has to go in because he's the emperor. He has to rule this empire. But he's so afraid that if he goes in, he will be murdered because of the Senate and everyone is kind of angry at that point of time. So he can't really. And then he goes back to Rome and circling and go back. And my dad said, this sort of very trouble with making decisions it's key to autism spectrum disorder. It's something we see. So I think actually you need to consider this. So if you go back and read all the sources, and I did, I looked at it and many of the things that I have interpreted in one way actually made better sense here.
Okay.
So I think that really shows how these two different disciplines can complement each other and why it's so important to do this cross-disciplinary work to actually do it. And then I reread because I was like, okay, I was completely wrong. I'm seeing him in a completely new light. So I reread all the sources and then I discovered one little piece of evidence that was fantastic because it's Suetonius who tells us about how Augustus is making apologies to the Senate because Tiberius, before he becomes emperor, he is making a speech or several speeches, and he's actually an okay speaker. It's going well. But when he speaks, he's doing strange movements or subtle movements with his hands. And then I was like, okay, if I'm thinking about autism,
is he stimming or...
Yeah. Is this actually stimming? Because if he was just like gesturing, because when you're talking, you gesture and all that sort of stuff, Augustus wouldn't mention it.
No.
But now he's talking about these movements with the hands, subtle movements. Unfortunately, he doesn't go into more detail.
But it had to be different than what you would usually
exactly,
see.
because otherwise you wouldn't mention it at all. And he's apologizing. So apparently this is something Tiberius does again and again and again.
And people notice.
So I was thinking, oh my God, is this like the first description of stimming that we actually have here?
Interesting.
So I really think, and that's also why we are now getting this chapter published in the Danish Medical Journal, because we think that we actually found something completely new here.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. And suddenly I see Tiberius in a completely different light because he becomes a very, very tragic figure because he was thoroughly bad as an emperor.
Yeah.
Not because he had this mental state where he couldn't act out the way he was supposed to do.
He wasn't meant for the role.
Exactly. Yeah. So we have people have these expectations to him, and he's in the most public role of the whole empire, literally. And he is fighting for himself to actually live up to this, but he's always falling short.
Yeah, he's trying very hard.
Yeah. And we can read, we actually have a letter, it's described in both Suetonius and I think Tacitus, and the wording is so similar, so we think this is actually a real letter, where he's writing, I'm doing my best here, why are you so angry with me? And then he becomes actually a very, very tragic figure.
Oh, that's really sad.
It's so sad.
Oh.
So I feel so bad for him. He was an okay emperor to begin with. He was a terrible emperor in the end because he let loose, because he was like, okay, if you don't like me, then I'm out.
Now I don't care at all.
Yeah. And it's so sad to actually read about it.
But then you diagnose him with Asperger's, right?
Yeah.
Or autism or...
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Asperger's is kind of autism spectrum disorder. It's actually, as far as I understand it, the diagnosis Asperger is going a little bit out of use. We still use it in Denmark, but generally in the world, they are not using it anymore. Now it's just autism spectrum disorder. But what's the thing about Asperger is that it is usually highly functioning people. They are very intelligent, but they just have these problems with actually reading the codes of social interaction.
There's a barrier there.
Yeah. So these are not stupid people at
No.
all. They are usually very, very intelligent, and usually they can also compensate a lot from this. They know when we are sitting talking, for example, if I had Asperger's, I would know how you would expect me to react, and I would react that way.
So you would adapt to sort of that.
Yeah, but of
social
course that
expectation.
takes a lot of
Practice.
and an effort. So they become extremely tired, and then they have to kind of pull back because they need to really get some peace so they can gather their sources again and then go out in the world. So they're usually highly functioning, but at least outside, but inside they are struggling. And that's also why we see that some of these people have a higher risk of actually unaliving themselves because they are struggling so much and they feel so misunderstood.
Yeah.
Also, some of the signs they give, for example, they have empathy. You should never think that someone with autism do not have empathy. They do, but they just usually show it in another way than we usually do, so they are not understood. And that's very frustrating for them, obviously.
Yeah,
that would
of
be
course.
for anyone. So that means that the people who suffer most is themselves. And I think that's the same with Tiberius.
Mental illness is also often depicted in ancient myths, for example, in stories of Ajax or Heracles, who went through these sort of violent episodes that were ascribed to divine intervention. There are also stories of the gods, like Dionysus driving pirates mad with hallucinations. What do stories like these tell us about the ancients' view on mental illness, and sometimes even as a punishment?
Yes, I think in a way, they show us the general idea in the public of how they saw mental illness. As I said before, the idea that it has something to do with people outside of you. Not, of course, not people, but gods. That gods could do this as a punishment, but also as a reward. For example, epilepsy could be seen as being touched by the gods. It's really not a nice sickness to have, but it could be because you were in contact with the gods, so that was a good idea or a good thing. So I think it shows us how normal people thought about it. That's, I think, that because the myths were generally speaking to the general public. So that's where we can see something about that. But we can't reach so much into the medical side of it from these sources.
And in antiquity, visions, prophecies, and altered states of consciousness could sometimes be interpreted as signs of divine inspiration, as you said, rather than illness. And even people like prophets and seers or the Pythia at Delphi. So how did ancient people distinguish between someone who was then divinely inspired and then someone who was actually mentally unwell?
Yeah. Well, were you a nuisance to society?
That was really the boundary.
Well, if you have to kind of cut everything away, yeah. The boundary is, do you hurt people? Are you annoying? Even annoying could be if you were like the sick person screaming in the agora, then they would also be kind of annoying.
If you're annoying enough, then...
Yeah. Or are you sitting there saying, apparently divinely inspired things that maybe at least would be interesting or maybe resonate with some people, then you're not a problem.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. You have to imagine we do not have hospitals or anything at this point of time. So basically insanity is in the view of the beholder.
Yeah. So it was sort of a case of like public tolerance in a way.
Yeah. If you're a problem, then you are insane. It is also, we can also see that in, for example, in our cases with Caligula and Nero. So it was also an easy slur to kind of throw at someone who was behaving unacceptable. So it's an easy way to kind of sum up that Caligula is bad in every way. He's insane. And that's also why they say it hundreds of times. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but they literally say, he's insane, he's insane, he's insane. Because then everyone knows, okay, so he's
to associate that stigma of mental illness with this person. Yeah. All right. We're getting close to the end of this episode, but I have a question. My second to last question is, what can studying mental illness in ancient times teach us about our own assumptions regarding mental health today, and why is it worth looking into?
First of all, it was exceptionally interesting, but that is one thing. But also I think it is, as I said, a very effective way to kind of mirror our own views on insanity and mental illness. It's a way to kind of confront the things that we think about people who suffer from anything from, autism spectrum disorder to schizophrenia to kind of put it up there, because some of these sources are so caricatured. It's so crazy what they're saying and how evil they are in describing this and how non-tolerant they are. So by seeing these exceptional examples, then we can maybe question some of the assumptions we have ourselves.
Yeah.
And then I found that some people actually also, we presented our book at Aarhus University, where we had a student coming up to us afterwards saying that he really thought he himself was dealing with autism spectrum disorder, and he really felt like he was seen when he read the chapter on Tiberius. He said, I have never felt so seen. Oh. And that was extremely touching, because that was actually something I hadn't even realized that an effect that it could actually have. But that is also in itself, that was enough. I felt like now I can rest now.
Yeah, but that's also sort of the value of work like this, right? To make archaeology and history relevant to the everyday person, that you can actually see yourself in these people of the past.
Yes, exactly. And we have a whole chapter on empresses like Messalina and Faustina the Younger and Julia the Elder, who has been labeled like these nymphomaniacs, where we look into what was this act, why did they get this label? Was it because they were these women who were maybe a little bit too out there? And then how did that whole idea of women, how did that actually affect psychiatry up until like 40 years ago, and actually have real life impacts on people until very, very recently. Yeah. And it was horrifying to read about, and they would do that by referencing back to the ancient sources.
They would legitimize it through those sources.
And that was horrifying, and that was really a very frightening travel through history, and how even in modern times we have used these histories from authors we know are biased, we know lied, to actually do real life surgery on people.
That's also something we haven't really touched upon, and I think you could make a whole other episode just about it, but the way that sexism in mental health and mental treatment is actually still so prevalent even today, right?
Yeah, and it's getting better. Our whole, as I said, the whole chapter is actually touching upon it. It's getting better, but there's so much there, so much things that we take for granted because we're told these stories for 2,000 years. Messalina even got a syndrome.
Yeah,
Guess what that was
That's
about?
our real legacy.
Yeah, especially when likely most of these women were innocent. But how that actually affects us even today, because it becomes a narrative that we just continue to tell ourselves again and again and again, and then it becomes truth. And we really have to kind of confront that. And I think one of the ways you can do it is, as we do in the book, draw the lines, show people this is why, this is where it happened, this is why we are here where we are today. Yeah. And then people themselves can see actually how wrong that is.
Show that domino effect, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And how it can kind of evolve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Christina, that takes us to the final question of this episode, which is, if listeners remember just one thing from this conversation, what would you hope it is?
I would hope that they would, first of all, learn from the cross-disciplinary way that we attack this problem, if you will, and also how interesting it can be to think it was fantastic to work with another discipline like that. Not just because he was my dad, but also because we could really question each other in ways and we could bring each other forward. So that I would hope they take. But I would also like them to take away from this, as an archaeologist, as someone who works with the literary sources every day, how relevant they actually are.
Yeah.
Even 2,000 years later. And that we can actually learn something. This is not just good stories. They are. They're very, entertaining. But we can also learn something. And they can actually touch us even today. And I think that's what makes history and archaeology so fantastic and always, always so important. And that's why they should not forget us.
Amazing. That marks the end of this episode. Christina, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been amazing to have you in the studio.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you, dear listener, for tuning into this episode of Let's Dig Deeper. I hope you've learned lots and that this has made you think differently about mental health in antiquity and maybe even in our own time as well. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can reach us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that is letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And please rate us 5 stars so that we can reach more people. You can find us on social media under the name Let's Dig Deeper. I'm Zinat Haroun and I've been your host. You can reach me on Instagram at @z_archaeology. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time where we will dig deeper into another topic. Bye!